It sounded like a joke, until it wasn't. Welcome to Echoes of Clues. I am your host, Shadow Teller. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your voice matters here. Let's dive in. On the afternoon of the Harvest Tea and Flower display, that piece was on public display. There were white-painted trestle tables arranged beneath the chestnut trees on the vicarage lawn. There were sponge cakes, seed cakes, cucumber sandwiches, and an ambitious trifle made by Mrs. Pritchard, who considered herself misunderstood in culinary matters. Near the hedge stood a long table of entries for the flower display. Dahlias, chrysanthemums, late roses, and in one rather severe arrangement of Michaelmas daisies which had been entered by Miss Lavinia Harcourt, and was being admired chiefly because Miss Harcourt herself was standing nearby and watching who admired it. Children ran about in clean clothes already under threat. Gentlemen from the parish council stood in small groups, discussing weather and rates in tones suggesting that civilization itself rested on their conclusions. Women exchanged recipes, condolences, opinions, and historical corrections with equal fluency. And seated a little apart, though by no means excluded, was Miss Jane Marple. She sat in a wicker chair near the edge of the lawn, wearing a soft mauve shawl and a hat decorated with violets that had seen good service and remained respectable. In her lap she held some pale wool, which she knitted with the absent-minded competence of one whose hands required occupation even when the mind had found something much more interesting to do. Miss Marple always looked to those who did not know her exactly like what she was expected to be, an elderly lady of no particular consequence, mild in manner, a trifle vague in speech, and very likely to remember whose mother had suffered from weak ankles in 1912. This was a mistake that many people made only once. She had been invited by the vicar's wife, Mrs. Julian Fenwick, who had a practical admiration for Miss Marple and the good sense not to say so too loudly. St. Mary Mead had taught Miss Marple that villages differed in details, but seldom in essentials. Little Barton's, after only 20 minutes of observation, was proving no exception. There now, said Mrs. Fenwick, appearing at her elbow with a teacup. I've rescued the last of the decent tea before Colonel Weatherby begins telling everyone how it ought to be poured. You are kindness itself, said Miss Marple. Mrs. Fenwick lowered her voice. A most mixed gathering, I'm afraid, though perhaps that is what makes these things succeed. Or fail, said Miss Marple pleasantly. Mrs. Fenwick laughed, not quite sure whether she ought to. Her eyes moved across the lawn with the vague anxiety of a hostess who is invited, in one enthusiastic moment, 3 people who ought never to be left standing together. We do seem to have a great many interesting personalities this year. This was certainly true. At the center of attention, as she generally expected to be, was Mrs. Viola Ashcombe, a widow of the late solicitor, Harold Ashcombe, and still the most imposing woman in the village, though time had sharpened rather than softened her features. She wore dark green silk, pearls, and an expression suggesting that even village festivities ought to be conducted with better standards. Beside her stood her niece, Miss Clara Wynne, a pale, pretty girl of 27 with intelligent eyes and a habit of smiling too quickly when nervous. Across from them lounged Mr. Gerald Trent, who had lately returned to Little Barton's after some years in London. He was charming, dark-haired, and generally spoken of by the village women as very pleasant, by the village men as too smooth by half, and by Miss Marple, privately, as exactly the sort of person who prospered among those who preferred agreeable lies to awkward truth. And near the cake table, laughing a little too loudly, was Dr. Stephen Colley, the local physician, a capable man whose good humor occasionally concealed irritation. With him was Mrs. Iris Bell, proprietor of the village dress shop, a widow with red hair, quick eyes, and a talent for knowing things before others admitted them. She was talking to Mr. Leonard Pike, the bank manager, a neat, dry man with careful cuffs and the expression of one perpetually disappointed by human arithmetic. and a little away from all of them stood Mr. Edwin Prowse, who owned Barton House. Barton House was the largest property in the district and had once been magnificent in a way now slightly frayed at the edges. Mr. Prowse himself looked much the same. He was a broad, well-dressed man of about 55, with a cheerful face that did not quite succeed in concealing fatigue. There was something expansive about him, his gestures, his laugh, even his anxieties. He liked to be liked, and had spent many years being so. Lately, however, one heard little remarks in the village. Not scandal exactly, but the kind of remarks that begin with, "Of course, one doesn't know the facts," and continue for quite some time. He was speaking at that moment to Colonel Weatherby, who had retired from somewhere military and never allowed the village to forget it. "I tell you, Weatherby," Mr. Prowse was saying in his hearty way, "if my chrysanthemums lose to Lavinia's arrangement of funeral vegetation, then the judging is clearly corrupt." Miss Harcourt, passing at exactly the right moment, turned her head and said, "My flowers do not require joking endorsements. Ah, Mr. Prowse." "My dear Lavinia, everything requires joking endorsements. Even I do." "You," said Miss Harcourt, "particularly." There was laughter. It was the expected village laughter, warm enough on the surface, selective underneath. Mr. Prowse accepted the small hit with good grace. "You see? Destroyed in public. I shall have to reveal everyone's secrets in revenge." "Please don't," said Mrs. Bell lightly. "No one would survive it." "Ah," said Gerald Trent, drifting nearer with a cup in hand. "But that would improve the attendance at next year's fete. People adore catastrophe as long as it happens to other people." "Is that one of your London sayings?" asked Clara Wynne. "No, only a village one with better tailoring." Again the easy laughter. But Miss Marple, glancing up from her knitting, noticed something very faint and very quick, a change in expression on Mr. Edwin Prowse's face. It had lasted no more than a moment. He had smiled, yes. He had looked amused, yes. Yet beneath the amusement there had been, unmistakably, a flicker of strain, not the strain of a man making a joke, but of a man covering one. Then he said, in a tone still playful but a shade too deliberate, "Careful, my dear fellow. There are some secrets in this village that ought to stay where they are. Sound policy prevents unpleasantness." The words were harmless enough. Almost everyone took them as part of the same bantering exchange. Almost everyone. Mrs. Viola Ashcombe stopped stirring her tea. Dr. Colley looked up. Mrs. Bell's smile held for an instant too long, and Clara Wynne, Miss Marple noticed, went rather white. "Well," said Colonel Weatherby, "as all villages have secrets. Dashed unhealthy if they didn't. Keeps the blood moving." That restored the tone. Conversation resumed. Cups clinked. Someone asked for more sugar. A child cried because another child had sat upon a paper windmill. The moment passed, or seemed to pass, as such moments usually do in company. Only Miss Marple, still knitting, thought that it had not passed at all. "Something wrong, Miss Marple?" asked Mrs. Fenwick, who had been following her guest's gaze. "Oh, no," said Miss Marple softly. "Only one always notices how very often people mean more than they intend." Mrs. Fenwick looked puzzled, but before she could ask for clarification, the judging of the flower display was announced. This drew a ripple of movement across the lawn. Miss Harcourt advanced with restrained triumph. The Colonel Weatherby objected to the process before hearing it. Mrs. Pritchard loudly maintained that preserves ought to have been included as a category and was again ignored. Miss Marple did not join the crowd around the display table. Instead, she let her eyes wander. Clara Wynne had moved to the far end of the lawn and stood half-shadowed by the yew hedge. Gerald Trent approached her almost at once, with the confidence of a man who assumed private conversations were his natural due. "You look as though someone has read your diary aloud," he said, smiling. "I don't know what you mean." "My dear Clara, you know exactly what I mean. She looked away. Uncle Edwin says all sorts of things. Yes, but he does not usually say them while looking as though the floorboards may open. That is absurd. Possibly. But then, absurdity often precedes scandal. Miss Marple did not hear Clara's reply, for the vicar, a tall, apologetic man with spectacles perpetually slipping down his nose, chose that moment to stand before the tea table and make a brief speech on community spirit. Nobody listened with much concentration. The vicar had a gift for sincerity that did not prevent fatigue in others. The prizes were awarded. Miss Harcourt received first prize for floral arrangement with the expression of a woman merely accepting what had always been inevitable. Mr. Prowse came second in chrysanthemums and declared himself the victim of a conspiracy. The children's baking prize went to a little girl who burst into tears when called forward. Applause followed in the kindly, irregular manner of village gatherings. Then, because no English event is ever complete without a little disorganization, a sudden gust of wind sent 3 napkins, a scorecard, and 1 hat sailing across the lawn. There was laughter again. People moved, chairs scraped. Mrs. Pritchard shouted that someone must rescue the cream. In that small flutter of confusion, Edwin Prowse was no longer standing near the prize table. Miss Marple noticed it at once, not because she had been watching him deliberately, but because one always notices the disappearance of the largest personality in a group. A moment later, she saw him crossing toward the side path that led around the vicarage shrubbery and out toward the lane beyond. He was walking quickly. Too quickly for a man merely in search of a cigarette or a quieter patch of sunshine. Behind him, after the smallest hesitation, went Clara Wynne. She did not run. She did not call after him. She simply set down her teacup on the window-sill, glanced once over her shoulder, and followed. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Dear me," she murmured. Mrs. Fenwick had heard only the tone. "Has something happened?" "Very likely," said Miss Marple. The other woman turned in alarm. "What?" "Oh, nothing one could put a name to." "Yet." 5 minutes passed. The vicar's wife was claimed by a crisis involving jam tarts and a wasp. Dr. Colley was summoned by old Mrs. Denham, who believed any excitement gave her palpitations and enjoyed both. Colonel Weatherby embarked on an anecdote no one could escape quickly. Gerald Trent, momentarily at leisure, lit a cigarette and watched the side path with narrowed eyes. Then Clara Wynne returned alone. She came back along the hedge-walk with her hat slightly askew and both hands clasped too tightly in front of her. Her face had recovered its color, but not its calm. She rejoined Mrs. Ashcombe, who spoke sharply to her in a low voice. Clara answered something equally low and sat down without taking tea. Miss Marple looked beyond her. Edwin Prowse had not returned. That in itself might have meant little. A man might be detained by any number of trifles. But Miss Marple had lived too long among drawing-rooms, parish teas, legacies, engagements, jealousies, unpaid bills, family resentments, and mistaken identities not to know when the air had changed. The air had changed. Even those who had not consciously observed anything began to feel it. Conversation became slightly brighter, as it does when people are compensating without knowing why. Laughter was a fraction too quick. More people turned their heads toward the lane than there was any reason for doing. At last, Gerald Trent flicked away his cigarette and said, "I wonder what has become of Prowse. One would think even second-prize chrysanthemums would not drive a man to exile." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Bell, "he has gone to telephone." "On a Sunday," said Leonard Pike dryly. "People do unfortunate things every day of the week." Mrs. Ashcombe said in a crisp voice, "Clara, where is your uncle?" Every head nearby might have denied listening, but all were. Clara looked up. I don't know. He wished to be alone for a few minutes." Mrs. Ashcombe's brows lifted. "Indeed." "It was nothing," Gerald Trent said softly. Nothing is generally the least convincing answer. Do stop it, Gerald, said Clara suddenly, with more feeling than the occasion required. There was a little silence. The vicar, anxious to mend any awkwardness he did not understand, suggested another round of tea. And then the scream came. It was not theatrical. Theatrical screams, Miss Marple had often thought, belonged mostly to young women in novels and people who practiced them in private. This one was raw, startled, and cut off almost at once, as though the person making it had frightened herself with the sound. It came from beyond the hedge, near the side path. For one frozen second, nobody moved. Then chairs overturned. Cups fell. Mrs. Pritchard cried, "Good heavens!" Colonel Weatherby barked, "Stand aside there," as though commanding troops. Dr. Colley started forward at once. Sir Gerald Trent was already ahead of him. Clara Wynne half rose and then seemed unable to continue. Miss Marple, who did not move quickly but often arrived first in understanding, set down her knitting. Mrs. Fenwick clutched at her arm. "What is it?" Miss Marple looked toward the path where the leaves still trembled from people pushing through. "I think," she said in her gentle voice, "that the afternoon is over." No one heard her. Beyond the hedge there came the sound of running feet, an exclamation, then another, lower, more dreadful because controlled. The vicar himself disappeared through the gap in the shrubs. A moment later, Dr. Colley's voice called out, sharp with authority now, stripped of all village ease. "Don't let anyone come forward." That was enough. Everyone knew. No one yet knew what had happened, or to whom, or why. But the pleasant order of the day had broken beyond repair. The cakes, the dahlias, the teacups, the harmless gossip, the old jokes, it all looked suddenly foolish and abandoned, like scenery left behind after the real play had begun. Miss Marple rose carefully from her chair. Her knitting slipped into the basket. A single ball of pale wool rolled across the grass and stopped beside the leg of the prize table. She did not hurry toward the path as the others had done. Hurry, she knew, was usually for those who wanted either to help or to witness. She could do little of the first and had never cared for the second. Instead, she stood still for a moment and looked at the faces left behind. At Clara Wynne, rigid and terrified. At Mrs. Ashcombe, pale with anger rather than fear. At Leonard Pike, who had gone grey around the mouth. At Iris Bell, and whose eyes were bright and hard, as if something she had long suspected had at last arrived. And then, quite suddenly, Miss Marple thought of Edwin Prowse's voice saying with forced amusement, "There are some secrets in this village that ought to stay where they are." People had laughed because it had sounded like a joke. Miss Marple suspected it had not been a joke at all. For a few moments, the vicarage lawn remained suspended between order and panic, as though unsure which it ought to choose. Then, almost inevitably, panic prevailed. Mrs. Fenwick pressed her hand to her mouth. "Oh, this is dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. Better not go over there," said Leonard Pike, though he himself had taken a step forward before stopping. Best to let the doctor handle it. But restraint was not a quality widely shared in Little Bartons when curiosity was engaged. Several villagers had already slipped through the hedge, despite Dr. Colley's warning. Their voices rose and fell in confused fragments. Miss Marple did not join them. Instead, she moved a little closer to where Clara Wynne sat, her posture so stiff that it seemed almost unnatural. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you look quite exhausted. May I fetch you something?" Clara shook her head too quickly. No, thank you. I'm quite all right." The words were automatic, almost rehearsed. Her eyes, however, were fixed on the gap in the hedge, wide and unblinking. Mrs. Ashcombe spoke sharply. "Clara, control yourself. Whatever has happened, it will be dealt with." "Yes, Aunt Viola." But her voice trembled, so Miss Marple observed this quietly. There was something in Clara's expression that went beyond ordinary shock. Fear, certainly, but not the vague fear of something terrible occurring. It was more particular than that. Personal. Across the lawn, Gerald Trent had returned from the hedge. His face was composed, but there was a brightness in his eyes that suggested excitement rather than alarm. "Well?" asked Mrs. Bell at once. He hesitated just long enough to draw attention. "I think it would be better if the police were sent for immediately." Mrs. Pritchard gave a small cry. "The police? Then it is serious." "My dear Mrs. Pritchard," he said lightly, "one does not usually summon the police for anything trivial." "That is not helpful, Gerald," said Leonard Pike. "No, but it is accurate." At that moment, Dr. Colley emerged from the hedge, and his manner transformed. The easy humor was gone. In its place was a brisk, controlled authority. "Mrs. Fenwick," he said, "we must telephone at once, and I would ask that everyone remain here for the present." There was a stir of unease. "Remain?" repeated Colonel Weatherby. "You don't mean to say—" "I mean exactly that," said Dr. Colley. "No one is to leave until the police arrive." A murmur ran through the group. Miss Marple noticed that several people reacted not with surprise, but with something closer to calculation. Mrs. Ashcombe drew herself up. "Surely that is unnecessary. This is a private gathering." "Not any longer," said Dr. Colley quietly. The words settled over them like a shadow. Clara made a small sound. "Dr. Colley, who is it?" For a moment he did not answer. Then he said with careful restraint, "It is Mr. Prowse?" There was a collective intake of breath. Mrs. Fenwick staggered slightly and caught the edge of the table. "Dead?" "Yes." The word fell with a finality that no one could soften. Clara's composure broke. No, that's not possible. I was just with him. He was perfectly—" Her voice dissolved into something between a sob and a gasp. Mrs. Ashcombe placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Clara, enough. This helps no one." But her own face had gone rigid. Miss Marple watched them both. "You were with him, you say?" she asked gently. Clara looked at her as though only just noticing her presence. "Yes, I mean, he wanted to speak to me. Only for a moment." "About anything in particular?" Mrs. Ashcombe intervened. "Really, Miss—" "Marple," said Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Ashcombe repeated with a faint edge. "I hardly think this is the moment for questions." "No, indeed," said Miss Marple agreeably. "Only sometimes, in moments like this, the smallest detail can be of use later." Dr. Colley nodded slightly. "She is quite right. Clara, what did your uncle say?" Clara hesitated. Miss Marple noticed the hesitation more than the answer that followed. He was upset about something. He said things were complicated, that perhaps he had been foolish." "Foolish in what way?" asked Gerald Trent softly. "I don't know." "Come now," he said, still in that same gentle tone. "You must have some idea." Clara's eyes flashed. "I said I don't know." There was silence. Miss Marple folded her hands together. It was not the denial that interested her. It was the force behind it. Dr. Colley said, "Did he mention anyone else? Any disagreement? Any concern?" Clara looked down. "No, nothing like that." Again, the hesitation. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward Gerald Trent. He was watching Clara with a peculiar intensity, as though measuring her, and then, quite suddenly, Mrs. Bell spoke. "He made a joke, didn't he?" Everyone turned to her. "At the table," she continued, "about secrets, about revealing them." "Sir," Mrs. Ashcombe's lips tightened. "That was nothing." "Was it?" said Mrs. Bell. "It was a joke," Mrs. Ashcombe insisted. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Jokes are often the safest way to say something dangerous." No one replied. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of a motor car approaching along the lane. The police. A subtle shift passed through the group. It was as though each person, consciously or not, drew back into themselves, adjusting, preparing. Miss Marple looked from one face to another. The fear was there, certainly. But it was not the same in each of them. Some were afraid of what had happened. Others, she thought, were afraid of what might be discovered. And that, she reflected, was always the more interesting kind of fear. The sound of the motor car grew louder, crunching steadily along the gravel lane beyond the hedge. No one spoke as it approached. Conversation, which only moments before had fluttered nervously across the lawn, now seemed to withdraw entirely, leaving behind a tense and waiting silence. Miss Marple observed how naturally the group arranged itself, not consciously, but with the quiet instinct of people who understood, without admitting it, that they were about to be judged. Dr. Colley stood slightly apart, arms folded, his gaze fixed toward the hedge. Mrs. Ashcombe remained seated but upright, composed, her hand still resting on Clara's shoulder, with an authority that suggested possession rather than comfort. Clara herself had gone very still again, though her breathing had not quite steadied. Gerald Trent, by contrast, seemed almost at ease. He lit another cigarette, despite the faint tremor in his fingers, and watched the entrance with open interest. The motor car stopped. Doors opened. Footsteps followed. Firm, unhurried, official. A tall man in a dark suit emerged through the hedge, brushing a leaf from his sleeve with mild irritation. Behind him came a uniformed constable, younger, earnest, and already looking overwhelmed by the number of faces turned toward him. "Inspector Hale," said Dr. Colley, stepping forward. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Inspector Hale inclined his head. His expression was neither sympathetic nor severe, but carefully neutral, a man accustomed to arriving after events had already gone wrong. "I understand there has been an incident." "Yes, Edwin Prowse. He's—" Dr. Colley paused briefly. "Dead. I see." The inspector's eyes moved across the group, not lingering on any one person, but missing nothing. "And the body?" "Just beyond the hedge. I've asked that no one disturb the area." "Quite right." He turned slightly to the constable. "See that no one else goes through there." "Yes, sir." The constable moved to the gap, his presence small but symbolic, as though marking a boundary between what had been and what now was. Inspector Hale stepped forward onto the lawn. "I should like everyone to remain where they are for the moment. I will speak to each of you in due course." There was a murmur of reluctant agreement. Miss Marple noticed again the different qualities of silence that followed. Some people waited passively, resigned. Others seemed to draw inward, as though already rehearsing their answers. Inspector Hale's gaze settled briefly on Clara Wynne. "You were the last to see Mr. Prowse alive," Clara started. I suppose so." "Yes." "Then perhaps you would be so good as to tell me what occurred." Mrs. Ashcombe intervened at once. "My niece is not in a condition—" "I am quite all right," Clara said quickly, though her voice betrayed her. The inspector waited. Clara swallowed. "He asked me to walk with him, just a little way. He seemed troubled." "In what manner?" "I don't know exactly. He said there were things that needed to be set right. That he had made mistakes." Inspector Hale's expression did not change. "Did he mention what those mistakes were?" "No." Again, the hesitation. Miss Marple's eyes flickered briefly toward Gerald Trent, who was watching with quiet intensity. "And then?" the inspector prompted. "We reached the path. He stopped. He said—" Clara faltered. "He said something about it being too late to pretend any longer." "Pretend what?" "I don't know. He didn't explain." Inspector Hale studied her for a moment. "And then?" I left him. I thought he wished to be alone." "You did not remain with him?" "No." "Did you hear anything after you left? Any sound, any voice?" Clara shook her head. No, nothing. The inspector nodded slightly, though it was impossible to tell whether he accepted the answer or merely recorded it. And how long was it before you returned to the lawn? A few minutes, not long. Miss Marple, listening, considered the answer carefully. Time, she knew, was rarely measured accurately in moments of emotion. Inspector Hale turned his attention to the others. Who raised the alarm? A young woman near the edge of the group lifted a trembling hand. I did. I was looking for my hat. It had blown over the hedge. And then I saw... She stopped, visibly struggling. Yes, that will do, said the inspector kindly. You need not describe it. He paused, then added, Was anyone else near the path at that time? There was a moment's silence. Then Gerald Trent spoke. I saw Mr. Prowse leave the lawn, he said, and Miss Wynne follow him shortly after. Yes, we have established that. I also noticed, Trent continued, that he appeared rather agitated. Not at all his usual self. Did you follow them? No. Did you see anyone else go that way? Trent hesitated just briefly. No one in particular. Miss Marple thought that answer was interesting. Inspector Hale turned to Dr. Colley. And you, Doctor, you were among the first to reach him? Yes. Can you give me a preliminary impression? Dr. Colley's expression hardened slightly. Only that the cause of death was not natural. A ripple passed through the group. Inspector Hale inclined his head. That is what I expected. He glanced once more at the assembled faces, as though fixing them in his mind. Until we have completed our inquiries, I must ask that no one leave the village. This time the reaction was stronger. Surely that is excessive, began Leonard Pike. No, not at all, said the inspector calmly. On the contrary, it is necessary. Miss Marple watched as the realization settled fully over them. They were no longer merely witnesses to a tragedy. They were part of it. And somewhere among them, she thought quietly, was someone who already knew exactly how Edwin Prowse had died and why. The difficulty, as always, would not be in discovering that a secret existed. It would be in understanding which of them had been most afraid of it being spoken aloud. The words settled uneasily over the lawn, as though the very air resisted accepting them. No one protested further, yet the silence that followed was not one of agreement, but of reluctant submission. Inspector Hale allowed it to linger just long enough. Now then, he said more briskly, I should like a clearer picture of the last half hour. Small details are often of the greatest importance. I would ask each of you to think carefully before speaking. Miss Marple approved of that. People rarely thought carefully when asked. They only believed they did, and in that difference, much was revealed. Inspector Hale's attention shifted first to Mrs. Bell. You were near the table during Mr. Prowse's remarks about secrets, I believe? Mrs. Bell met his gaze steadily. Yes, we all heard it. Did it strike you as unusual? It struck me as unnecessary, she said. Men don't generally joke like that unless they want to see who reacts. A faint movement passed through the group. And did anyone react? The inspector asked. Mrs. Bell smiled slightly. Oh, yes. Though not in any way they would thank me for describing. Nevertheless, I should be obliged if you would. Her eyes flickered. There's just for a moment, toward Clara Wynne. Then away again. Miss Wynne seemed distressed. Mrs. Ashcombe was displeased, and Mr. Pike, she paused, as though choosing her words carefully, looked as though he had remembered something he would rather have forgotten. Leonard Pike stiffened. That is quite absurd. Is it? She said lightly. Inspector Hale raised a hand, cutting off the exchange. Mr. Pike, you will have your opportunity. For the moment, I should like you to tell me, did you have any recent dealings with Mr. Prowse? Pike adjusted his cuffs, though they required no adjustment. Naturally, I'm the bank manager. Of course. And were those dealings entirely satisfactory? There was the smallest pause. As satisfactory as one might expect, Pike said. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him thoughtfully. That was not, she considered, the same as satisfactory. Inspector Hale seemed to reach a similar conclusion, but did not press the point. Instead, he turned to Gerald Trent. And you, Mr. Trent? You returned to the village recently, I understand? Yes. Had you renewed your acquaintance with Mr. Prowse? One might say so. In what capacity? Trent smiled faintly. Socially? Nothing more? Nothing that would interest you, I imagine. Inspector Hale regarded him for a moment. On the contrary, I find that most things do. There was a quiet tension in the exchange, like a thread drawn taut but not yet broken. Miss Marple noticed that Clara Wynne had turned slightly toward Trent, as though listening for something more in his answer, but he said nothing further. Inspector Hale moved on. Mrs. Ashcombe, you are Mr. Prowse's sister-in-law? Yes. And Miss Wynne's guardian? I have acted in that capacity, yes. Then perhaps you can tell me whether Mr. Prowse had been under any strain recently. Mrs. Ashcombe's expression did not change. My brother-in-law was a man of fluctuating moods. I would not describe that as unusual. No financial concerns, no disagreements, nothing of consequence. Miss Marple thought that answer was both precise and entirely uninformative. Inspector Hale inclined his head slightly, then turned once more to Clara. You said your uncle spoke of things needing to be set right. Did he mention any names? Clara hesitated again. Miss Marple watched her closely. The girl's hands were clasped so tightly now that her knuckles had gone white. No, Clara said at last. It was, Miss Marple felt, the most deliberate answer she had given so far. At that moment, the constable at the hedge shifted his position slightly, and a low murmur drifted from beyond. Inspector Hale glanced toward it, then back at the group. I will need formal statements from each of you, he said. But before that, there is one further point. He paused, letting the weight of it settle. Dr. Colley has indicated that Mr. Prowse's death was not natural. I can now confirm that it was, in fact, the result of deliberate action. The words landed heavily. Clara made a small, strangled sound. Mrs. Fenwick sat down abruptly. Even Colonel Weatherby, who had faced louder shocks in his life, looked grim. Murder? Said Leonard Pike, his voice thin. Yes, said Inspector Hale. The simplicity of it was more disturbing than any elaboration. Miss Marple folded her hands once more, her mind already moving ahead. Murder, she reflected, did not introduce disorder into a village. It revealed the disorder that had always been there. Inspector Hale's voice continued calm and measured. Which means that one of you, at some point within the last half hour, had both the opportunity and the reason to bring about Mr. Prowse's death. No one spoke, but Miss Marple thought she could almost hear the unspoken thoughts moving among them, calculations, denials, recollections hastily rearranged, and beneath it all, something else. Not just fear of being accused, but fear of what might be uncovered along the way. Her gaze drifted once again to Clara Wynne. The girl had lowered her head now, as though unable to meet anyone's eyes, and Miss Marple, very quietly, began to wonder not only what Edwin Prowse had meant to say on that path, but what Clara already knew he had meant. Inspector Hale allowed the weight of the word to settle before speaking again, as though he understood that silence, properly used, could do more work than any question. I will now need each of you to account for your movements, he said, particularly during the minutes after Mr. Prowse left the lawn. There was a faint shifting among the group, the quiet rearrangement of people preparing to speak, or to avoid doing so. Miss Marple remained where she was, hands folded, her attention moving not to the inspector, but to the small, unguarded reactions that flickered across faces before they were brought under control. Colonel Weatherby, the inspector prompted. The colonel cleared his throat. I remained here, entirely here, speaking to Mrs. Pritchard about the judging. Most unsatisfactory, I may say. Mrs. Pritchard nodded vigorously. Quite true. We were discussing the preserves. Inspector Hale inclined his head. Thank you. His gaze shifted. Mrs. Bell? She did not hesitate. At the cake table. Then I went to speak with Mr. Pike. I did not leave the lawn. Pike gave a small, stiff nod. That is correct. Mr. Trent? Gerald Trent flicked ash neatly to the ground before answering. I was here, observing as one does. Observing what? Everything, he said lightly, including the fact that several people seem rather more interested in what others were doing than in explaining their own actions. Inspector Hale regarded him for a moment. Sir, and yet you have explained very little of yours. Because there is very little to explain. Miss Marple thought that was not perhaps entirely true. The inspector moved on. Mrs. Ashcombe. I did not leave my seat, she said crisply, nor did I see any reason to do so. Her tone suggested that if she had, it would have been entirely justified. And Miss Wynne? All eyes turned again. Clara lifted her head slowly. I told you. I returned here. I sat down. I did nothing. And you spoke to no one? No. Miss Marple noticed that Gerald Trent's gaze flickered toward her at that answer, then away again. Inspector Hale nodded once, then turned to Dr. Colley. And you, Doctor? I was called to Mrs. Denham. She complained of palpitations. I remained with her until the scream. Can anyone confirm that? Yes, said Mrs. Denham faintly from a nearby chair. He was with me. Quite attentive. Inspector Hale made a small note. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was considering something else entirely. Not what had been said, but what had not. There had been no mention, she realized, of anyone passing along the side path between the moment Clara returned and the scream. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. And yet Edwin Prowse had died there within those few minutes, which meant, she thought, that either the opportunity had been very carefully taken or very carefully concealed. Her gaze drifted again toward the hedge, beyond which the body lay unseen. Inspector, she said gently. He turned toward her, mildly surprised. Yes, Miss Marple. Yes, Miss Marple. I wonder, she said, whether it might be useful to consider not only who was absent, but who had reason to believe Mr. Prowse might speak. There was a slight pause. Inspector Hale's expression sharpened just a fraction. What do you mean? Well, said Miss Marple, with the air of someone discussing something quite ordinary. If a gentleman makes a remark, quite a noticeable remark, about revealing secrets, it is natural to suppose that those who possess such secrets might feel uneasy. A faint ripple passed through the group. Uneasy enough, she continued softly, to wish that he should not say any more. Mrs. Ashcombe's voice cut in. That is a very serious suggestion. Yes, said Miss Marple mildly. Murder is usually that. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Inspector Hale studied her. And do you think that is what happened? Oh, and I think it is very likely that Mr. Prowse intended to say something. She replied, something that at least one person present would have preferred to remain unsaid. And you believe that led directly to his death? I believe, said Miss Marple, that people are very often more afraid of embarrassment than of guilt, particularly in villages. Her eyes moved almost idly across the group. To be exposed, she added, is sometimes worse than to be punished. No one spoke, but Miss Marple saw quite distinctly the effect of her words. Mrs. Bell's eyes had narrowed. Leonard Pike had gone very still. Gerald Trent's faint smile had faded. And Clara Wynne. Clara had closed her eyes. Inspector Hale drew a slow breath. An interesting observation, Miss Marple. Oh, merely a general one, she said. I have lived in villages all my life. He nodded. then turned back to the others. "In that case," he said, "we shall proceed on the assumption that Mr. Prowse's death was not only deliberate, but motivated." He paused, his gaze steady. "And that the motive, whatever it may be, is known, at least in part, to someone standing here now." The words settled heavily. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, though she did not yet begin to stitch, because she had the distinct impression that the truth was already present among them. Not hidden, exactly, but waiting for the one small detail that would make it impossible to ignore. The inspector's arrangements were methodical. Statements were taken, times repeated, small contradictions quietly noted. The body was removed with due care, and when the lawn, so recently a place of harmless festivity, became a waiting ground for answers. Dusk had begun to gather by the time Inspector Hale returned from his final examination of the path. The villagers remained, though their earlier energy had long since drained away. Conversations had dwindled into murmurs. No one wished to be the first to leave, and none were permitted to do so. Miss Marple, seated once more with her knitting, had not, in fact, completed a single stitch. At last, Inspector Hale approached her. "You have been very observant, Miss Marple," he said. "I should value your thoughts." Miss Marple looked up with mild surprise. "Oh dear, I should not like to interfere." "I think," said the inspector, "that you already have. Most helpfully." She smiled faintly. "Well then, perhaps I may make a small suggestion." The others, sensing something, drew closer, not openly, but with the quiet inevitability of people who know that the end of a matter is near. Miss Marple folded her hands. "It seems to me," she began, "that we have been thinking of this as a question of opportunity. Who could have reached Mr. Prowse along that path without being seen? But that, I think, is not the correct approach." Inspector Hale said nothing. "One must consider instead," she continued, "who knew that Mr. Prowse was about to say something, and what that something might have been." Her gaze moved gently but unmistakably toward Clara Wynne. Mr. Prowse's remark about secrets was not accidental. He wished to provoke a reaction, and he succeeded. Clara's head lifted sharply. "He spoke again to Miss Wynne on the path," Miss Marple went on. "He told her that it was too late to pretend any longer, that things must be set right." A silence fell. "Now," said Miss Marple softly, "that is not the sort of thing one says without meaning something quite specific. And it is not the sort of thing that would alarm a stranger, but it would very much alarm someone who understood precisely what was being referred to." Clara's hands trembled. I don't, my dear," said Miss Marple kindly. "You do." Inspector Hale's voice was quiet. "Miss Wynne, what was Mr. Prowse intending to reveal?" Clara stared at them, her composure finally breaking entirely. He said he couldn't keep it hidden any longer, that it wasn't fair, that people would find out anyway." "What, Miss Wynne?" the inspector pressed. She gave a small, desperate laugh. "That I wasn't his niece." The words struck the air like a blow. Mrs. Ashcombe gasped. "Clara!" "It's true!" Clara cried. "I'm not his niece. I'm his daughter. He had an affair years ago before his wife died, and when my mother died, he brought me here, and Aunt Viola agreed to pretend." Mrs. Ashcombe's face had gone rigid with fury. "This is not the time." "It is exactly the time," said Inspector Hale sharply. Miss Marple nodded gently. "And you feared that if the truth became known, it would bring consequences." Clara's voice dropped. "Everything would change. The will, the house, everything." Inspector Hale's eyes sharpened. "The will?" "Yes," said Leonard Pike suddenly, his voice strained. "Prowse had recently altered it. I handled the matter. Miss Wynne stood to inherit a considerable sum." There was a murmur. "And if her position were called into question?" the inspector asked. Pike hesitated. It might complicate matters. Miss Marple spoke softly. And Mr. Prowse had decided to correct the pretense, to acknowledge his daughter openly. Clara shook her head wildly. He didn't understand. He thought it would make things better, but it would have ruined everything. Inspector Hale's voice was steady. And so you followed him? Yes, I followed him to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. He kept saying it was the right thing, and then... Her breath caught. And then, said the inspector. I only meant to frighten him, she whispered. I picked up a stone. I told him he mustn't say anything, that it would destroy us both. And he laughed. He said it was already too late. And then... She covered her face. I didn't mean to kill him. The silence that followed was absolute. Inspector Hale spoke at last. Oh, you struck him? A small nod, and left him there. Yes. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. It is so often like that, she said quietly. Not a grand plan, but a moment, a fear, a loss of control. Clara's shoulders shook. Mrs. Ashcombe said nothing. Inspector Hale signaled to the constable. Miss Wynne, I must ask you to come with us. She rose unsteadily, her composure gone entirely now. As she was led away, Miss Marple watched her with a deep, quiet sadness. The lawn slowly emptied. The villagers departed in subdued groups, their earlier gossip now replaced by something heavier, something closer to unease. Inspector Hale paused before leaving. You saw it very clearly, he said to Miss Marple. My dear Inspector, she replied gently, one sees these things very often. Only the details change. And the motive? Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful smile. People do not like their lives to be rearranged without their consent, even when the truth is involved. He nodded, then turned away. The evening settled over Little Barton's once more. The chairs were stacked, the tables cleared, the traces of the afternoon quietly removed. And yet, as Miss Marple walked slowly toward the gate, she reflected that nothing had truly been restored. Because the most dangerous secrets, she thought, were not the ones hidden from others, but the ones we tell ourselves must never be spoken at all. And those, as she well knew, always found their way into the light eventually, whether gently revealed or violently silenced.